have a lot of different options when it comes to the different ways one can go about playing retro video games these days. In this video, I'm going to go over the many different ways to play retro video games and try to explain some pros and cons of each one. But before that, I would like to humbly invite you to consider subscribing to this channel. It would greatly help me grow this channel if you would share the videos that you enjoy with your friends. Now, what even are retro video games? What makes a video game retro? I thought I knew what a retro video game was until I sat down and thought about what makes it a retro video game. I want to talk about the classification of retro video games. I had a college professor say that each artistic advancement was necessarily predicated by a technological advancement in the medium. Technological advancements in the tools used to create the media and to play the media are necessary before the artists, programmers, and developers can take advantage of them. A growth in technology has to happen before the art can be created that takes advantage of it, and that is especially true when it comes to video games. Shout out to Professor Dave Satland of Seattle. For example, the Atari 2600 era couldn't exist without the development of affordable microprocessors and the cartridge. The NES era couldn't exist without the advancements in the power of microprocessors, and then later the development of memory mapper chips and the Famicom disk system. The artistic aesthetics of a particular era of games is influenced by the technical limitations and realities that were relevant at the time that they were made. The aesthetics of the 8-bit era is a result of the technical limitations available to the programmers and the designers of the era that used them. Same with the later 16-bit games and every era of video game development. So, 8-bit aesthetics are shaped by the technical limitations of 8-bit game systems and the creative tools that the game developers had at the time. I want to talk about what I consider to be a retro video game, and I actually have an issue with the term retro video game. Retro actually means a new creative work which is in the style of an old work, and a real retro game would be a newly developed game that's in the style of older games. For example, Shovel Knight, Bloodstained, Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Shredder's Revenge, and Streets of Rage 4 are all examples of true retro games. The problem is that the term retro games has become ubiquitous for referring to older video games. Both Merriam-Webster and Dictionary.com have a similar definition of retro, of or designating the style of an earlier time, retro close, and relating to, reviving, or being in the style, and especially the fashions of the past. A more accurate term would be classic games. The problem is that no one uses that term. Nintendo actually used the term classic to refer to their mini consoles for the Super Nintendo and the NES. Not retro, classic. So, for better or for worse, we're stuck with the term retro games and retro gaming to refer to nostalgic video games of prior generations. The term retro video games is here to stay, and I'm doing my best to make peace with it, despite the fact that I'm currently making a rather lengthy YouTube rant against it. But let's move on. There are no real consensus around what makes a retro video game. Some people consider a retro game to be 1 or 2 generations back, and some have their own rules for what they consider to be old, classic, and retro. Both Merriam-Webster and Dictionary.com do not have a definition for retro gaming or retro video game. However, the only site that does have a definition of note is Wikipedia. When I went back to college, my professors would not allow us to cite Wikipedia, so I get a devilish pleasure doing so. Wikipedia defines retro gaming as retro gaming, also known as classic gaming and old school gaming, is the playing and collecting of obsolete personal computers, consoles, and video games. Usually, retro gaming is based upon systems that are outmoded and discontinued. Although ported retro gaming allows games to be played on modern hardware via ports or compilations. It is typically for nostalgia, preservation, or authenticity. A new game could be retro-styled, such as an RPG with turn-based combat and pixel art in an isometric camera perspective. So, Wikipedia does not differentiate between older classic games and newer retro-style games. But then, later on in the article, it gets to defining games. The distinction between retro and modern is heavily debated, but it usually coincides with either the shift from 2D to 3D games, the turn of the millennium, and the increase in online gaming, or the switch from analog to digital for audiovisual output from 4:3 to 16:9 aspect ratio. For me, I consider a video game to be retro if it has the following. 1. At least 2 generations of technology behind. 2. Not getting any new official licensed games from the platform maker. 3. Has a distinct aesthetic style linked to a generational technical issue that some game developers are now starting to attempt to recreate with their retro games. That last bit about game developers creating new games in the style of an older game system is optional. There are definitely a ton of retro games made with 8-bit and 16-bit style, and we are just now starting to see new retro games being made with early 3D graphic stylings, so that they look like something out of the PlayStation 1 and the N64. So, the Nintendo Famicom and NES are definitely considered retro, the Super Nintendo and Super Famicom are definitely retro, the N64 is definitely retro, and so is the PlayStation 1. Some people consider the GameCube, Dreamcast, PlayStation 2, and OG Xbox to be classic gamings because they're a couple generations behind, but there's not a lot of game developers that are starting to make newer retro games in those styles yet. But if you take newer retro games in the style of older systems out of the equation, then it would be possible to consider the Wii U, the Xbox 360, and the PlayStation 3 to all be retro game consoles because they're not getting any games made for them, and they're definitely a generation or two behind. But I'm not sure that that particular style is being recreated by newer developers for aesthetic purposes. So, circling back to my original question. So what is a retro game? Whatever you consider to be a retro game. There is no official definition, and whatever you personally consider to be a retro game is a retro game. I consider every game system made before the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 to be considered retro. That includes every Atari console, Sega console, NEC console, and the OG original Xbox, the PlayStation 1 and 2, and every Nintendo console before the Wii. I personally do not consider the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 to be considered retro consoles, but I'm open to people who do. It's an evolving issue. That was part 1 of this video. Part 2 is going to go over the many different ways to play retro video games and which one may be right for you. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and hit the bell icon to get notified when a new video goes live. Also, don't forget to share these videos with your friends and enemies who are into retro video games. This is 8-Bit Joystick. Stay awesome. Play retro. Yes, I'm recording a video. If you could just chill out for a couple seconds, I could finish this video, and then I could go back to hanging out with you.